Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're about to start. We've got quite a few people watching this online, so I think we'll try and get started on time if we can. Thank you all for coming, to those in the room and those online, and anyone who might be watching the recorded version of this in a week or two's time. So anyway, on with today's proceedings. Today I'm delighted, honoured to be joined by John Fitzmaurice, OBE, and Emeritus Professor David Mullins to discuss how a grassroots movement helped secure one of the most innovative housing programmes of recent decades, the Empty Homes Community Grant Programme. Before I hand over to them, can we flick the slide? Just got the gyroscope one. Just a quick kind of comment really on the impact this fund had on our organisation, Giroscope. So, as you probably are aware now, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary. We have 150 properties. In the period between 2012 and 2015, we completed 48 properties in slightly less than 3 years. So that's basically a third of our housing stock was developed during that short period, a period when we had access to the Empty Homes Community Grant Programme. So as you can see from the slide, we received just under £1 million of this capital grant. We blended it with about 1.2 million of debt finance from the bank, and we got to work buying and renovating properties, 38 houses and 10 flats, housing over 100 people in total. Other impacts, which we'll talk more about later this lunchtime, 130 volunteers, people on work experience were involved in this work, and 6 apprentices were working at that time as well. So that's our introduction. I'm now going to hand over to our two guests. So by way of introduction, I'll start with you, John. Can you tell us how you got involved in the housing sector?
Serendipitous, actually, like Giroscope. Can you hear me okay? No. Right, okay. So I was a social worker in Birmingham, and I was convinced I was going to change the world. Full of ideals and grand plans. And then it dawned on me after about 2 years that wasn't going to happen. So I gracefully bowed out of the social work world and found myself a job working with a project in Birmingham called Shape Housing Association. Can you hear? No? Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, it's tilted. This microphone you have to have it really close up to your mouth. So I was working with a project called Shape Housing Association, which was quite novel. And we had unemployed kids and kids out of care and on probation working on empty properties, which were on license from the local authority. So yeah, so we had unemployed kids and kids generally out of care and what have you, living in a hostel on Stratford Road, 185 Stratford Road, which would be banned these days for health and safety reasons. And but it worked fantastically well, and we had properties on license from the local authority in Birmingham, because Birmingham were buying up lots of houses for renovation. Yeah, and it never left me really. The vision and the sense of achievement that was achieved really inspired me, and so from then onwards I had various jobs in housing, from housing associations, empty property, homelessness and what have you. But that was how I started in housing.
And can you just tell us briefly about your time at Shelter, John? You were involved in the days of Shelter.
Well, I was on the board of Shelter actually, and Shelter. The next project I went to after Shape was a project called Housing Emergency Office, which was about a national project involved in promoting the use of empty homes, and that was at Shelter. But I'm afraid these days Shelter is a huge organisation with 900 staff and 80 million income. Yeah, but has ceased to actually make grants to projects, which is rather a shame, because they used to raise loads and loads of money and hand it out to the homelessness projects and projects like Giroscope. So that came to an end when Sheila McKechnie was the director, and I resigned. When I took over as director of CHAR, campaign for homeless and single people, I thought it was best to leave shelter.
Okay, thanks for that, John. David, maybe you'd just like to give us a bit of background about your origin and also in the squatting movements of the 1970s.
Thanks very much, Martin. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, and just really want to say at the introduction, we're in a former church, and I just want to thank God for Giroscope, really, in terms of the survival for 40 years, and actually showing there's an alternative way to do this kind of work, and to work with communities. So that's really why I was so pleased to come today and to hear about the 40th anniversary. My entry into housing was in the local authority sector. So I worked for 2 London boroughs, Hackney and Camden. And Hackney was a real kind of learning experience on a whole heap of areas, but one of which was that local authorities like Hackney had bought a lot of housing from the private sector, but they really didn't have the resources to do anything with at the time. So it was really, if you look at the growth of the and then decline of the council housing sector, I joined in 1980, and it was right at the real peak of council housing, just coinciding obviously with a famous politician who kind of got rid of it thereafter. But the issue that I was learning about is how the local authority was managing the fact that they'd acquired substantial amounts of private housing in poor condition that they were either going to demolish or improve, but they couldn't do anything in the meanwhile. Some of those properties were squatted, and the bit that I reflected on with Claire and Martin was that I experienced this through something called the Short Life Users Group, which was a kind of point of liaison between the council and the group, some of whom had been squatted initially, but increasingly there were people who were getting access to housing through a more formal process. And it was simply, for me, a meanwhile use of a public resource that would otherwise have left empty. So it's not kind of a heroic connection with squatting that I think might have been anticipated, but more a managerialist kind of view that this was actually a really sensible solution at the time to empty public housing. So from that experience, I stayed in public sector housing until the late 1980s, and experienced a range of things, including homelessness, but I'm not really going to feed that into the discussion today. I joined Birmingham University, and former colleague Ed Ferrari is here today, Centre for Urban and Regional Studies at the University of Birmingham in 1988. And from entry to the university, the main thing that I worked on was kind of a miracle of the time, which was a massive expansion of the third sector in housing through what were then called housing association. I think what were then called a housing association movement. And I was very enthusiastic about the way in which something that wasn't government and wasn't market was able to fill the gap and provide solutions. Housing action areas, area-based improvement, housing with regeneration, all of those really positive things that accompanied the expansion. But I probably studied it for too long, and I was on Changing with the Times was the name of the project. And boy, have housing associations changed from where they were in 1974 with the 74 Housing Act. And so really became somewhat disillusioned with some of them, but really whether this was a third sector solution, because increasingly it was about becoming part of the state response, substituting for council housing, but also increasingly marketised in terms of where the resources were coming from, but also what the implications of that on how housing associations operated. So In that kind of void, my next role in the University of Birmingham was in something called the Third Sector Research Centre, which was around sort of time of Tony Blair, and it was looking at the expansion of non-governmental, non-profit, what used to be called voluntary sector. Social enterprise was increasingly popular sort of terminology at the time, how they were moving into providing public services. And I was asked to take an overview on housing and the third sector, and came up with a number of areas to work on, from cooperatives to what had happened to the housing association movement, tenants organisations and so forth. But then the bit of serendipity happened, and I met John Fitzmaurice, and working paper number 5 turned into self-help housing. So exploring the role of self-help housing, and it was just at the point that some really interesting things were going to happen. And I think John will take the story on from there before I go on too much.
Okay, John, will that lead us into the origins of the Empty Homes Community Grant Programme, which I think Dave's just pulled the trigger on there?
It's an unlikely story, really. Fast forward to about 2009, and I was working freelance, and I was looking for sort of things to do which I thought would be useful. And I thought I'd hark back to Shape and Gyroscope and Latch and Canopy, of which I was aware. And I wrote to Tudor Trust, if you remember Tudor Trust, and suggested that it would be a good idea to put together a website which would be like a shop window for self-help housing projects, to so people could see what was going on, and people who were doing it could get could network between them. Yeah, and Tudor happily agreed to fund the website, so I was operating in that sort of area. Yeah, and I met David at a hacked reception, and I said to David, told me about his interest in housing, and so we went and had a cup of coffee all over in all bar one in London Bridge, and out of that the paper he just described came forth. And then we decided we'd try and promote his findings. And we contacted Building and Social Housing Foundation, which is now called World Habitat. And we went to Colville. I remember David and I went to Colville in April 2010. And we met the director, Diane Deacon, and she said to us, I'll tell you what, she said, I'll give you a 24-hour residential conference in St. George's, Windsor Castle. To our amazement, yeah, we couldn't believe it. You know, this is completely unexpected, yeah.
So this conference was held in the walls of
Windsor Castle.
Windsor Castle,
sort of knobby sort of place called St. George's, which is a conference centre, yeah, where people go with sort of hot towels over their heads to try and work out the world's problems, yeah. We had this conference, and out of the conference, the conference was on the 10th of December 2010, and there's a report of the conference. And out of that conference, just before the conference in October, the government had announced the Empty Homes Programme, that they were going to have an Empty Homes Programme of £100 million. And so some people at the conference said, why don't we actually put a bid in for some of this money and sort of have it ring fenced for community housing projects? And so the people at Building and Social Housing Foundation very happily, very kindly produced a proposal, and this is the very proposal on which the Community Grants Programme was formed. And the proposal suggested that the money should be top-sliced off to 100 million and made available to grassroots community organisations. And we got into a dialogue with DCLG about this, and they were quite interested in it, yeah. And very fortunately, this demonstrates how serendipitous things are. The guy who was the Deputy Director General of the DCLG at the time was a guy called Richard McCarthy, who I knew. He'd worked as Hyde Housing Association's head of temporary housing, and he'd also been in a squat in Southampton when he was a student, called Prangle. And so unlikely as it might seem, he said, yeah, this would be a good idea, let's do it. And so out of that conference and out of that proposal came the £50 million Empty Homes Community Grants Programme, which started off as 30 million. And then, because it was very successful, then turned into 50 million.
And what was the significance, John, of it being a community grants program? How did that slice of money differ from the rest of the money in the program?
Well, the big thing about it was it wasn't going to be delivered through the Homes England or the Housing Communities Agency, yeah? Because the trouble with all the money being delivered through the Homes and Communities Agency, i.e., which is now Homes England, was that you had to be a registered provider to access it, and therefore most 95% of the organisations that got the community grants programme would have been excluded from it. So the money was made available through a third party. The DCLG invited bids from various organisations to administer the grant, and an outfit called Tribal, who there's very little known about them. Anyway, they administered it and they did it quite well, and so it was freely available to organisations. And there was 120 applications and 150. It started off with expressions of interest. There were 150 expressions of interests, and then there were 110 grants made in the end.
So the key difference here between this funding and the usual funding from Homes England is this was available to every third sector organisation, every community. Even if they hadn't previously been involved in housing, they could apply for this money.
Yeah, and that was a big change, because when housing associations were getting going in the 70s and 80s, it was fairly easy to get hold of a housing association grant. It was called HAG, and therefore there were lots of startup housing associations. But as time progressed, the rules and restrictions got more and more complicated, and fewer and fewer grassroots organisations would have had access to housing corporation money. So this was a sort of turnaround, sort of money through the back door.
And would you say quite a risk for the government, the authorities to take, to let money out in this way?
It was an insane risk, which if anybody had done a proper risk assessment, they probably wouldn't have allowed it to go ahead. But fortunately, it was propelled by enthusiasm and ignorance.
Well, we certainly, from this money, we'd say got nearly £1 million, and it was very clear that the intermediary, Tribal, weren't particularly knowledgeable about housing, and I think that actually was an advantage to how the grant ran.
My comment about ignorance, yeah. It was actually, I mean, it wasn't actually a affordable housing program. It was a program about empty property delivered through the private DCLG's private rented sector. So it didn't impinge terribly on housing experts. It was free of expertise in housing.
David, do you want to add anything on the origins of the Empty Homes grant program before we move on to its successes or otherwise?
Thank you. Yeah, I think in the background, or maybe in the foreground, there was the politics of the time, and it was a formation of a coalition government. And the Liberal Democrats came into the coalition government. Is there a Liberal Democrat here today? I think. Yeah. The Liberal Democrats had come in with the scandal of empty homes, and somebody's got to do something about it. We've got some nice quotes from the Liberal Democrat minister at the time, and so they got agreement that there would be an empty homes programme. So that was like first stage. The second thing was that the Conservative side of the coalition, maybe encouraged by the Liberal Democrats as well, I'm not sure, but had come up with this thing called the Big Society. We were going to see move from big government to big society, with communities taking more responsibility. And some people saw that as essentially a shift from government without resources to community, whatever. But they had to, if they were talking about the big society, they had to have some examples. And I think John was remarkably successful at getting the self-help housing model as an example, so to such an extent that the housing minister, Grant Shapps, said, "The superb work that these housing schemes are already doing shows the scale of what can be achieved when community self-help is combined with cash incentives from government." Well, there hadn't been any cash incentives from government, but it kind of indicated that there might be now. So I think in the background that was really good. The only other thing on the observation, at some point we were looking at the different forms of community-led housing, and as a kind of back of the envelope description, I described self-help housing as one man and a website. because if you compare the resources that John brought into this game with some of the other outfits who are operating in other areas of self-help housing, it was essentially at the core of it one man and a website funded by the Tudor Trust. But if you look at why it was effective, what was attracted around that one man and a website, active projects like Giroscope, Canopy, able to share successful ways of doing stuff, but also bringing in other supportive organisations from BSHF, and we'll tell some others as the story goes through. So just two really observations there. Thank you.
Thank you, David. John, wanting to add to that at all?
No, it's a good description, really. It was thanks to the Lib Dem. It's thanks to the Lib Dems having empty homes in their manifesto, which the coalition then decided to sort of do something about. Yeah, that really also led to it. But yeah, we should move on to.
Yeah, I mean, I think just from what I'm hearing, it hopefully is an inspiration to people listening to this as well, that you can change government policy.
Oh, I think
that, and we're talking about £50 million of government policy being changed, and that's being changed by, well, one man and a website. Clearly there was a few people involved in this and some certain amount of serendipity, as you say, but sometimes when people think nothing can be changed, it sounds like that.
Yeah, well, we're
exactly what was
going to get onto the future in a few minutes, but I think there's every reason to believe that it's possible to make changes, and it's possible to capitalize upon people's ideas, and if you can log into the zeitgeist, then things can happen.
Okay, well, now we've established that this money has been secured back in, and it started to be made available to groups in 2012. I think now is whether it was successful or not in the defrayment of this money. So if I hand over to you, David, and some slides, maybe of the program.
Thanks, Martin. Just hoping that I can get the slides to progress on here. Yes. Are you doing it, Claire? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so one of the main things that the university was involved in, with like John, with a lot of partners, a lot of organisations who supported this work, that was really the early phase of identifying what the demand would be. And then looking at the applications, but then going through the process of what support was provided, capacity building, I think that should be termed, to enable people to apply for the grant on the timescale. This was fairly responsive, but still the timescales were a problem, weren't they, for groups in terms of getting applications in. And then during the period of the programme, looking at what the impact of the programme projects was regionally. So we had regional case studies, and then individual case studies like visits to Giroscope, etc. So looking at, if I had to summarise what was significant about it, it was a departure from large-scale procurement of affordable housing, because it was actually about small scale, and it was about trading on local relationships in order to ensure that the benefits of the investment were maximised across the piece. So it was almost like the opposite of what the direction that procurement was going in social and affordable housing generally. So it was a £50 million programme, as John said, in the end, but that went between 110 projects. So the actual Giroscope got about 1 million, didn't it? The actual scale, but on a project level, is extremely small in relation to other similar programmes. It was very good value for money in that perspective, and leverage. One of the main things that funders look for is what other money is being attracted in on the back of the grant funding. And there was a survey, in fact, done by colleagues at HACT, which showed that 26.4 million came in on the back of the 50 million, mainly from loans from borrowing, but also from grants from other sources, social investors, and so forth as well. We've already covered that the key selling point, the key advantage of the programme was that it was non-registered providers, a number of whom, over half, had not been involved in housing directly prior to the programme. And then a lot of emphasis on peer support. So rather than a top-down control mechanism, Tribal was relatively weak as a funding coordinator, but the projects were learning from each other through events facilitated by John and by Hacked throughout. So we go on to...
Can you just tell us who Hacked are, David,
Sorry.
just for a reference
Housing
point?
Associations Charitable Trust, which again, like Giroscope, has quite at least a 40-year history. I'm not sure it was longer, but they were initially about grant funding of community projects from housing associations, but they turned into a different kind of intermediary organisation. And I suppose what they're best known for nowadays is measurement of social impact of housing association activities. This was a significant program across the country, but it was particularly important in this part of the world. So if we look at Yorkshire, Humberside regions together, we're seeing a substantial chunk of the overall national program. And this reflected the fact that we're already hotspots in Leeds, in Teesside, and in Hull, where people have been doing this kind of stuff for some time. So it was actually, that's the importance of the peer support and transfer. So 15 projects were funded around here, and some of them were successful in getting second stage funding as well. Can we move on? Yeah, sorry. Okay, in terms of assessing the impact, on the first slide, we have the leverage and the value for money of the numbers of homes brought into use as a result. That will be the conventional way to look at the benefits of a housing regeneration programme. In trying to sort of get a framework for looking at this programme, I think it was really important to recognise that by investing, by doing the work on the properties, by employing people to do that work and training supporting them, by using local knowledge to identify where were the empty properties and which ones could be brought into use. There's a whole heap of additional things which you would not get typically from a large-scale nationally procured programme. So these are the benefits that we, I think, identified quite early on, but used in the regional case studies. So I'll just take a couple of examples. And I agree with the comments earlier about housing thriving outside, these projects thriving outside of the housing silo, because they were outside of housing regulation and the funders didn't know a lot about housing. So these benefits came through. So I think the ones which we place a lot of emphasis on are the ones at the bottom, the construction skills and qualifications and employment training. Groups have been using housing to enable people to gain skills in construction and going on that pathway for a long time, but actually having a more dependable flow of work from the Empty Homes Grants Programme over a couple of years. That on the case studies, that made quite a difference to what the offer was going to be. So in terms of moving from short-term traineeships to longer-term apprenticeships, links to college courses, having a specialist construction manager within the team, all of those things were possible, and several of the organisations demonstrated that one. A second example, safer neighbourhoods and secure communities up the top left there. I've got really good example from Huddersfield. It was a really good example. Unfortunately, the project it has not survived, but the benefits there were really important. This was about doing up a number of houses in a small geographical location close to the community centre. And so that turned around the feel of the neighbourhood. It addressed concentrations of crime, but most importantly, in terms of the community confidence, the feeling of confidence about being in that neighbourhood, which is actually it's called a village, and it actually feels very like a nice sort of neighbourly sort of community. And then the other one I've selected, community-based social enterprise down the right-hand side. Redcar down the road from here was a good example of organisations that had not done housing before being attracted into this programme. So we had Redcar Mind, who a mental health charity. We had Communities Kick, which was a African cultural organisation looking at dance and other activities. So these organisations worked with the housing specialist, Community Campus, and were involved directly in some of the works to the properties, the volunteering benefits. Their clients also benefited from the access to the housing provided. And this example, I would say, exemplifies the phrase scaling out rather than scaling up. What I left out earlier, my experience in the Third Sector Research Centre, was when people were talking about the third sector role expanding, they were looking for big, efficient, large-scale organisations to deliver services. What the self-help housing sector expansion has exemplified is scaling out. That's having a spread of activity, also a spread of investment and community benefit across the areas by local organisations receiving and taking responsibility. Sorry, I've gone on too much, but I think this is, in terms of evaluation, these are the things which look very different to me from most of the other programmes that I was involved in evaluating whilst at the university. So one final slide. When we had to give a title to the evaluation report, it was the best thing. The best thing was, in the words of one of the volunteers in Canopy in Leeds, it was about seeing the combined effect of a volunteer activity when somebody moved into a new property. Always there's a thrill, I think, when people move into a new property, be it provided by a large-scale housing provider, being a house they bought themselves. But there's actually something additional here, I think, when volunteers have actually contributed to the outcome. And in Canopy at the time, residents were expected to volunteer for a set number of hours, not necessarily on their own property, but on the work of the organisation generally before they moved in. So you're actually embedding that kind of volunteering benefit into the way the organisation and programme works.
Thank you for that, David. And if people want to work on the evaluation of this project, where would they find that? You'll send. We can put that around. Brilliant. John, would you like to make any comments on the impact of the Empty Homes Grant Programme?
David turned it off. Right. Anecdotally, just it inspired various other trusts and foundations to fund empty property work, provide capital funding for empty homes. Yeah. So Land Aid funded 1.3 million. We'll put 1.3 million pounds into a fund for supporting capital housing projects. Nationwide committed 1.7 million. So it's only 3, but you know, it was an incremental thing. And actually, Power to Change had a program called Homes in Community Hands, which wasn't exclusively in any way, to any extent, involved in self-help housing, but it did bleed into some of the projects, some of the grants, and some of the support that was provided bled into the self-help housing sector. So there was quite a lot of activity kick-started by the community grants program. So it's very satisfying.
Okay, John, I'm conscious that time is passing. Hopefully we can question. Try that one. Is that better? Yeah, that's better. So just before we lead into that, a couple of things really. I just would quickly want to ask John and David about whether there's any relevance to what we talked about today to where we are now in 2026. We've got Andy Burnham coming down from the north to take control in 2 weeks' time. We've got local funding like Pride in Place, which has come into this neighbourhood. We've had the reports from the Independent Commission on Neighbourhoods, Hilary Armstrong's work. A lot of talk about devolution coming down to street level, about money coming down at ever more devolved levels. There is still an issue clearly with empty buildings, residential and non-residential, and there's clearly a private rented sector in Hull which is not really fit for purpose, which is too big, and a lot of it's now coming on the market for sale. So it feels like there's some opportunities there. We've got Alan Milburn talking about 1 million young people who are not in employment or training or education. So I just wondered if quickly, before we open this up to the floor, how you see what happened in terms of whether it's any use to us today, whether this is something we should be talking to the government about.
I think the agenda has changed now. I mean, there's still a staggering number of empty properties around the country. There's no doubt about that. But at this very moment in time, it's not really on the political agenda. In fact, 25 organisations wrote to Matthew Pennicott back in February about empty property and urging him to take some action about it. And we're still waiting for an answer, which is pretty gloomy. But nevertheless, there are other things going on which I think could be seized upon. One of which, of course, is the focus on neighbourhood revitalisation, which is very a close relation to bringing. Well, it encapsulates very much what Giroscope and the Canopy and Latch and all the other organisations have done. There's a 5 point. Who's heard of Pride in Place? Who hasn't heard of Pride in Place? Everyone's heard of Pride in Place. Okay, it's a 5.1 billion program. It only covers 376 areas, but I mean it's a big program over 10 years, and that's about revitalising neighbourhoods, and it's what self-help housing is also about revitalising neighbourhoods. So I think there's a sort of hook on which to hang further thought and further action on. In the context of that, I'll pass you over to David.
Thanks a lot, Martin. Shall I just answer the question and not show any more slides? You've probably had too many slides. Yeah. Okay. I think there's no doubt that we do need something like the Empty Homes Community Grants Programme, because I think the case for the grant is the tricky thing, because obviously loans will be much more the way to do things now. And the question of the income stream that the properties will generate once they're done up can be factored into the cost of the project. I do also think the environment has changed even since the coalition government. I think the things that would make it more difficult now are, I've been going on about it, large-scale procurement, supply chains which suck benefits out of the areas in which the activities are actually taking place, loans rather than grants, sector-based regulation. I think the case for doing this work without the social housing regulator, if it is in any way seen as a socially funded project, that might be more difficult. So I think there can be challenges. But what we did in 2015 was to say it's a bit similar to my Venn diagrams one, but the question was, what are the benefits to government of a program like this? And we went through the same sort of headings as on the Venn diagram and identified the outcomes. And at the time, 2015, these matched very well against the stated sort of policy objectives of government. And I think we should try to do something similar once it emerges exactly what it is, apart from number 10 North and devolution to the regional level. We need to identify what would be the opportunities and the spaces that this project like this can fill. But certainly if the word on housing is council housing, I can see there will be some immediate opportunities if you scaled up council housing with meanwhile use, because usually these projects take some time, and if you're dealing with existing buildings, there's possibilities for temporary use of those buildings by groups, community groups in the kind of interim. But I think the other limitation is by council housing. I think we're excluding most of the neighbourhood regeneration, community regeneration type stuff that social housing, self-help housing organisations have been doing for the last 40 years. And so I think actually having a label for what you do and linking it to the intrinsic benefits for government, particularly in terms of the NEETs agenda, employment and training and so forth, is probably the way to go forward. So my aspiration is that Andy Burnham says something like Grant Shapps, but we've seen what you do, and it's what we want to do, and there'll be some, if there's some government funding for it, it's going to get even better.
Thank you, David. We did invite Andy Burnham today, but we only invited him yesterday, so I'm a bit disappointed that he turned up. Before throwing things open, the other thing on your table is a flyer about the Northern Way. There's a QR code there that you can scan. The Northern Way is something where we're putting together like a collaboration of projects across the north of England and the Midlands that are doing similar work to ourselves, and that kind of work that evolved from the Empty Homes Community Grant Programme. And I think by having a collaboration and a sort of collective, we can be in a much better position to lobby government for this type of funding in the future. So take a look at that, see what you think, and obviously come back to us with comments and observations. But while we've still got some time left before lunch, I think we got lunch turning up just after 1 o'clock. I would like to just open the floor. So if anyone's got questions for David or for John, fire away. Claire will come round with a microphone. And your dinner won't come any quicker if you don't ask questions. Still coming at 1 o'clock.
Question, it has to do with, I talked to a person in Hull City Council recently, and they said, first of all, that community-led housing tends to provide higher quality than the big actors in the subject was more new builds at this particular point, but I mean, I think it could just be expanded to also to empty homes. So they said they're provided basically better quality, and I think they were talking more than just housing quality. I think they were talking about effects in neighborhood and environmental standards and everything like that. And then they said that that actually aggregate all different community housing in the country, it's actually the numbers are substantial. That did a big contribution to, and then they said the reason why that's visible is because of the diversity of projects. Then it's hard to do this, to put a number on this, to do the work of aggregating these diverse ways of doing things and putting one big number on it. And this person suggested that if someone were to do that, then that would be very helpful for policymakers to say, okay, we're going to divert a lot of this fund.
Okay, Aviv, I'm just conscious of time. Stick that into a question.
My question is really, are these three things true? As far as you're concerned, is it doing this in terms of putting numbers on it, communicating this to policymakers? Basically, that's my question.
David or John, who wants to tackle that one?
Yeah, I think definitely true that where decision making at the organisational level is in the hands of the future residents or the community that are supporting it, there tend to be quite high aspirations, particularly around environmental sustainability, because what we've seen in more mainstream housing is a bit of a rollback from the aspirational standards across the piece. People like demonstration projects, but they don't tend to be consistent across the for obvious kind of cost-related reasons. What we have seen, I was involved in the Homes and Community Hands evaluation as well, and what we did see there was a number of projects reducing their aspirations to do the same thing that developers do in terms of balancing the overall cost of the project. So I think it's really great that the aspirations are there and that they're placed on the development partners that they work with, but it doesn't mean that you avoid the inevitable cost quality kind of conflict which any housing does have. But I would definitely support what you're saying, Aviv, in terms of a difference with community-led housing is there probably is more pressure for standards and quality than there would be in other aspects of the housing system. Obviously, we're talking here about the private rented sector in Hull, and I think if we think about, well, what are the standards and how does that match with the aspirations of future residents?
Who else we got?
I have a question. Do you think there's any, so you may have answered this already, but I've been busy doing technical things. Do you think there's any justification for having a housing or a capital element to Pride in Place so communities can buy, you know, empty homes, empty properties within that programme?
I'm already on. Yeah, that's one of the problems with Pride in Place. There isn't any capital funding for housing in it. Yeah. And if you're going to revitalise neighbourhoods, then you've got to address not just empty properties, but the absentee private sector landlords and the general shortcomings of the private rented sector. So yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that one could hope that might come out of the new regime, and with Anti-Burnham appearing on the scene, and a greater focus on neighbourhood revitalisation.
Okay, there was your next, Govind, yeah?
Two that I heard, I think, which were intriguing. One was an insane risk for DCLG at the time, and the other was serendipity and the important role of serendipity in MT. I mean, it's great to hear about that particular grant program coming into being, but I'm sure we would all agree we don't want good policy like that to be left to chance. So I think sort of going forward, how do we anticipate what the insane risks in the eyes of government would be now, you know, with Andy Burnham coming in and so on? And how would we address those?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know it's a field that you have probably more knowledge of than I do, but in terms of policy analysis and why do certain policies come about and others not, when we were looking at the evidence on this one, I was looking at somebody called Kingdon who had this policy windows theory. It's probably going way back and probably shows my datedness, but it seemed quite a convincing way of explaining how empty homes community grants came about, because you had the solution, the housing organisations have always had the solution. The problem is for someone to regard it as their problem that's being solved, and actually bringing together the problems and the solutions in an arena. I think Windsor Castle Policy Suite Conference Centre was the place that the problem and the solution were brought together. But fortunately, that action within the coalition government of the fight for an empty homes programme already having been won, made the solution of, if we're going to have a programme, why don't we top slice it, easier, I think. But all of those things are contingencies, really. How do you bring all together in one place all of those things? And I used to think that policy was about rational planning, and that you started off with a set of objectives and you worked out how you could best achieve those objectives. But if you look at certainly housing policy, but probably any policy in this country, there are all kinds of contingent factors that are more important. So what I think we should be doing with Burnham number 10 North agenda is to really sort of look at how can we match the solutions that we're offering to what seems to be currently most important within that new strand in the Labour government, to see how we can produce that matching. We probably won't get Windsor Castle again, but we need to have a place where problem and solution can be matched, an agreement can be reached, and even better if they think they're already doing it, because that's the really good one.
Yeah, if I can just say that the whole thing about the Northern Way, which is really this, it's a sort of manifesto really, online, and there's a website, as you can see, and the manifesto is really outlining all the different benefits of the community revitalisation and refurbishment and self-help housing, what can be offered to the government and what can be offered to communities, and yeah. Because so much of community-led housing is about new build schemes, and more southerly new build schemes, and they take a long time to pull off. They need very complicated funding, and they capture the interest of politicians. So the Northern Way is an attempt to rebalance the agenda and point out the opportunities that exist for refurbishment and neighbourhood renewal.
Thank you, John. So you've got a microphone, Chris.
Yeah, okay. Is it working?
Do you want to just say where you're from, Chris, to give it a bit of context?
Okay. Chris Bailey from Action on Empty Homes. So
thank you.
Advocating for your work, among other things. Somebody mentioned insane risks. I think probably the most insane risk for a new government would be to expect, when they talk about, devolution and localizing solutions, the same old centralized solutions to work. And I think the powerful message that organisations like Giroscope and people who represent them can give to the Burnham government is that this is an example of real localism from the bottom up. And the strong temptation for all governments is no matter how much they talk about localism, is still to try and get a centralised solution and to expect big solutions that make big impact. And that means big companies, big programs, big housing developers and big housing associations that suck so much money out of the system through the contracting process. And this is the exact opposite of this. The impact per pound of this kind of program is so much more powerful, and the durability and sustained impact that organisations like Latch, Canopy, Giroscope, etc. make is such a good proof. I mean, in a sense, you have done this in very, very unfriendly public sector policy terms, really. Okay, the grants program helped, but 2/3 of your housing wasn't delivered through that program. It was delivered in probably the worst time in terms of public policy, and I think it's really important to make that point, because it's so easy sitting at the centre, and particularly if you come from a background that has always been quite centralised. Even no matter what you talk about, it's very, very easy to still look for that solution. And I think there is hopefully a policy window where, if only because we can inspire a different kind of government and a different kind of local solution, it's a bit like, you should back this stuff because it proves your point, right? If you want more of it, then you have to back the people that are doing it, and you have to give other people. You need the next generation of gyroscopes. And that's not going to happen on its own, I don't think.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris. I mean, I agree with every word you said, and I think part of what we're doing today, by bringing the audience we brought together today, both in the room and outside the room, is to, and I think John and David have shown us that influencing policy is possible, and that's what your and Bridget's organisation does. So hopefully let's not call it the start, but hopefully this is the start of something. And I think with the Burnham government and the Burnham agenda, there might be the right ears to hear that. Whether anything comes of it, we'll see. But if we don't try, then certainly nothing will come of it. Okay, Govind, I know you had a question.
And there's a question from someone online, but I think Govind's first.
He's been waiting a long time for it.
Okay, my question was just to obviously just think ahead. If similar funding was to be presented today, looking at the project, what do you think would be the main takeaways of where things did as effectively as they could have, without looking backwards, maybe to help for future projects?
Sorry, Govin, could you just repeat the last bit of that? So
what I'm trying to establish is, if a similar to be launched today, what things didn't work as effectively as we would have liked?
David, John, do you want to take that question? Didn't work.
It just seemed to me we did have it was a bit of a boosterish evaluation report in terms of all the positives, but we did say there were some things which didn't work as well as we would have as would have been hoped. One of them was the classic one about the speed of the application process. And so obviously bidding works much better for large organisations that have got projects on the shelf and they bring them into play when the funding becomes available. So we were talking yesterday about sort of intermediaries and the extent to which there could be a sort of like a Yorkshire and Humberside intermediary that did the capacity building and the basically getting the pipeline ready for when the funding is agreed. And so I think that is certainly something that will be a challenge, as it was last time. Some projects will be definitely ready to go, but if the aim is scaling out, it's for projects who are on the end of that process that obviously are going to take. And so this is why the tragedy with all these programs is that they always seem to be short-lived. You don't seem to have a continuity of funding between even between one parliament and the next within a government term. And it would need 5 or 10 years to get the maximum out of a new program. But it's not saying that we don't need it now and we couldn't use it now. One of the things that we might encourage, the Northern Way might encourage, is a sort of expressions of interest similar to the one that John organised last time, so that we have got an idea of which organisations would have projects that they could take forward. And I remember that point about leverage. If they've actually got resources that they could link to a project, I mean, I know it may be impossible for most organisations, but it's something that would definitely help.
I mean, it has to. Yeah. It's the case that, I mean, although the program was really quite very, very successful, there were some projects that didn't succeed, and there were some people who were bidding who couldn't deliver the homes which they aspired to do so. But that aside, there are what we discovered, particularly from the expressions of interest recall that we did at the very beginning, is there are an awful lot of organisations out there. If do you know locality, people who know locality, there are a lot of organisations in the membership of locality, a lot of social enterprises that are doing things very, very close to housing, providing support and facilities management and training and education and stuff. And housing is one of the things. They're working with vulnerable people, and one of the things that they would like to get into is housing. So there's a sort of a ready-made oven ready group of projects around all the time who could be engaged in a housing project if the opportunities were there. So it's a question of actually sort of matching the resources with potential delivering organizations that can deliver.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, Govind, I don't think the kind of failure rate was as high as you might expect with a pot of money going to such a wide range of organisations. And I think the other thing, and people who have worked in housing in this room will know, is housing is a tough business. And I think some third sector organisations entered into this grant programme just seeing the housing as which is fine, as an asset for their organisation or an income stream, but didn't actually realise that managing housing, both from the kind of building and maintenance side and from the people side, is actually, especially in poorer neighbourhoods, is a tough thing to do. And I think some people weren't ready for that.
of the great things about the program, which we haven't really talked about, is it enables people to buy houses and create an asset base. And once you've got an asset base, then you've got the sustainable income for the future, and also assets against which to borrow. Yeah, and that's the key thing. And the whole housing association movement actually was given, if you're familiar with that, between the 70s and 80s and early 90s, they were given hundreds of millions of pounds in grant by government to provide housing. And then suddenly one day the Housing Corporation, as was, woke up to the fact that the organisations they were funding were actually very asset rich, and they decided to change the grant regime into primarily a loan funding regime. Yeah. But in order to get going, you do need grants, and in order to build up that asset base and against which you can borrow and against which you can create a sustainable income flow. And I think that's what Giroscope's done very successfully.
Thank you, John. Any more questions?
Hi, Bridget Carey from Action Empty Home. Just thinking in terms of barriers that we have now, we are currently just coming to the end of a project where we've been looking at community-led retrofit of empty homes as they're renovated. And one of the big problems that the projects have come across is local authority commissioning. There's two local authority areas where we're working, and one of them has 3 houses that it's renovated, and the local authorities actually commissioned the work on this one. But because they go through their European style commissioning, the company that got the work to do the contract to do the first property was 80 miles away from the community where the accommodation was being renovated. So they had no local connection, they had no relationship with the local college, and part of the contract was to provide follow-on employment for a couple of the trainees. They weren't able to do that because they weren't local to the area. And it was a real battle with that local authority to get them to change the commissioning approach for the second 2 houses, which they did, and the outcomes that we had hoped for were achieved there. And they just aligned with that is the contracts that local authorities enter into with large housing associations for their empty homes work. And again, there's another local authority area where we're working, where there's money for empty homes, there's delivery work, there's targets around empty homes, but it's all locked into a contract with a large housing association. So part of the work that we need to do, I think, in terms of, number 10 up north and that kind of thing, is to have that conversation about, well, let's think about commissioning, let's think about the local pound staying in the local community. And I know it's not housing, but I think it's a very important conversation to have.
Thank you, Bridget. And Paul, quickly, because I'm just really conscious of time, and I know our online audience will be leaving us.
Paul J. Davis, portfolio holder for economic renewal and housing at Hull. So I'll put the question first. Can community-led housing tap into institutional funding? The reason I ask is over the past couple of years, been to 6, 7 housing conferences, and repeated message is that they're expecting probably about 25% of private sector landlords to exit the market. So there's going to be a vacuum and a bit of a void. And what they're expecting is a consolidation of portfolios and institutional monies queuing up to try and take advantage of it. But obviously, you've said that community-led housing can be much more efficient in delivering a product. So on your own, you might not be able to get on that table, but collectively as a network of community-led housing providers is a way to speak to pension funds to get into capital, because it's waiting, the money's waiting there to be used in housing.
John, David, do you want to take that on quickly? Pension funds, John. Pension funds. I was sat on a panel with someone from one of the big pension funds the other day, and I got the distinct feeling that the numbers he was interested in were numbers that do not relate whatsoever to the sort of organisations, you know, and Giroscope isn't tiny, but to the sort of organisations being mentioned in you know, either as receivers of Empty Homes Programme or Northern Way.
You might actually be able to be big enough to take advantage of some of that stuff.
I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I mean, there is money available, as you say. But I think the trouble is it's the finance model is about loan funding, and I think what's needed for community grants for self-help housing and community-led housing organisations are grants. It's not very fashionable, but as I said just before, housing associations are only where they are because they were given huge amounts of grants at the beginning, and that's the way it is, I think.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end there. Sorry, Mark, for people that didn't get their questions in. Thanks once again to Professor David Mullins and to John Fitzmaurice, OBE, for travelling all the way to Hull today. And I hope some of their insights have been really useful and food for thought as you, have some lunch and we can all talk amongst ourselves. I'll quickly hand you over to Claire, who's, along with Andy and the team here at St Matthews, have organised today and made it all happen.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, I just want to point out that there's some information on the tables there about our future events, so check them out, especially our 40th anniversary dinner. Tickets are now available. Thank you.